Just going to be presenting the scripture reading, and we'll be looking at Luke 7:36 to 50. It says this: Now one of the Pharisees invited Jesus to have dinner with him. So he went to the Pharisee's house and reclined at the table. When a woman who had lived a sinful life in that town learned that Jesus was eating at the Pharisee's house, she brought an alabaster jar of perfume. And as she stood behind him at his feet weeping, she began to wet his feet with her tears. Then she wiped them with her hair, kissed them, and poured perfume on them. When the Pharisee who had invited him saw this, he said to himself, "If this man were a prophet, he would know who is touching him and what kind of woman she is, that she is a sinner." Jesus answered him, "Simon, I have something to tell you." "Tell me, teacher," he said. 2 men owed money to a certain moneylender. One owed him 500 denarii and the other 50. Neither of them had the money to pay him back, so he canceled the debts of both. Now which of them will love him more? Simon replied, "I suppose the one who had the bigger debt canceled." "You have judged correctly," Jesus said. Then he turned toward the woman and said to Simon, "Do you see this woman? I came into your house. You did not give me any water for my feet, but she wet my feet with her tears and wiped them with her hair. You did not give me a kiss, but this woman from the time I entered has not stopped kissing my feet. You did not put oil on my head, but she has poured perfume on my feet. Therefore, I tell you, her many sins have been forgiven, for she loved much. But he who has been forgiven little loves little." Then Jesus said to her, "Your sins are forgiven." The other guests began to say among themselves, "Who is this who even forgives sins?" Jesus said to the woman, "Your faith has saved you. Go in peace." This is the word of the Lord.
Well, welcome back again today as we continue on in our series, 12 Rules for Life. Jesus, formula for a truly commendable existence. And if you didn't get one of these, you need to pick one up. This is Pastor Merrick's fantastic work. Isn't his work always amazing? Look at that. Everything he does is like so amazing. So take one of these, don't fold it. You don't fold this stuff, right? This is art, okay? Don't fold. Some of you are like, oh, I folded. You're hiding it. Don't fold it. Take it home. You might want to frame it. Put it up somewhere. It's really cool. And after we get through this whole series, it'll make even that much more sense as we continue on today. 12 rules for life. Just a quick recap. The first 4. Number 1, be willing to swim against the current. Rule 2 was do good in a way that elevates God, not yourself. Rule 3, don't follow your GPS into a lake. Some of you are like, if you weren't here, you might have to go back and take a listen to figure out what that's about. And then rule 4, keep your word no matter what. And keep in mind, all of these are online, so you can go onto our YouTube channel and see all of these. You can get there through the website. If you go that way, you will find them. If you didn't have a chance to take in one of the weeks, please do go back and take a look. Today, rule number 5 is treat every person with the utmost dignity. Let's start by reading Matthew chapter 5 and picking it up at verse 38. It says, "You have heard that it was said, eye for eye and tooth for tooth, but I tell you, do not resist an evil person. If someone strikes you on the right cheek, turn to him the other also. And if someone wants to sue you and take your tunic, let him have your cloak as well. If someone forces you to go 1 mile, go with him 2 miles. Give to the one who asks you, and do not turn away from the one who wants to borrow from you. You have heard that it was said, 'Love your neighbor and hate your enemy.' But I tell you, love your enemies and pray for those who persecute you, that you may be sons of your Father in heaven. He causes his sun to rise on the evil and the good, and sends rain on the righteous and the unrighteous. If you love those who love you, what reward do you get? Are not even the tax collectors doing that? And if you greet only your brothers, what are you doing more than others? Do not even pagans do that? Be perfect, therefore, as your heavenly Father is perfect." Now, if you were to go to Luke chapter 6, we mentioned already in this series that there's a parallel passage there on this Sermon on the Mount that Luke records. And in his rendition, at the end of this section on loving your enemies, he has Jesus sharing what has become known as the Golden Rule. So take a look here in Luke chapter 6, verse 31. At the end of that passage, he says, "Do to others as you would have them do to you." Interesting. You know, learning a language is one of the most enriching experiences that you can actually engage in, I think. It's a wonderful experience to learn a different language. I would encourage you to do it if you've never tried it. It's really worth the effort. Not only do you learn to communicate to a whole new group of people that you couldn't communicate with before, but you improve your lateral thinking skills, you learn a lot about a different culture, and you gain insight even into your own language that you speak when you learn a different language. I really enjoyed French in high school, and I was a rare person. There wasn't a lot in my class that really loved it, but I actually did enjoy it. And good for me, because when I was in my early 20s, I met the beautiful Sarah Fugère. Yes. So, wow, did that ever pay off in spades. So at that point, I really had to start learning it, because her parents said, "We don't speak English. You're going to have to learn how to speak French." And so I had to really start working at it. And a lot of my learning actually revolved around Christian faith when I was learning French. I studied the New Testament in French because I already knew the Bible really well. So I'm like, well, if I read this in French, I already know what it's saying. And I would listen to it on audio cassette. Remember audio cassettes? Right? Remember those? So I would listen to audio cassettes while I was reading the Bible. And I was doing that while I was at seminary too, because I really wanted to, accelerate this and be able to talk to people in French. One of the words that I learned very early on, because I was using, a lot of Christian hymns and Christian vocabulary and reading the Bible, one of the words I learned very on in the word in French was the word "digne," which is the word for worthy. We would sing songs like "Seigneur, tu es digne," which is "Lord, you are worthy." And if you notice, what does that word look like? Any English words that come to mind? Dignity, right? This is where we get our word dignity from. You can see that pretty quickly. Well, my understanding of that English word was immediately enriched. You see, this is how language works. As soon as I saw this is where the word dignity comes from, I understood what dignity is about. Dignity is about worth. It's about someone's worthiness. And so immediately there's this enriching that takes place. Dignity is worth or value. To treat someone with dignity is to treat them as though they are worthy or intrinsically valuable. And we use the word for God a lot because he obviously is most worthy. And that is good and correct for us to do that. But Jesus also treated us in the same way. And this is what is very interesting, that he treated us rather like we are worthy. Just to look at the first few verses of that passage that Chad read in Luke chapter 7. Let me kind of refresh your memory here. Starting at verse 36, he says, "And one of the Pharisees invited Jesus to have dinner with him, so he went to the Pharisee's house and reclined at the table. When a woman who had lived a sinful life in that town learned that Jesus was eating at the Pharisee's house, she brought an alabaster jar of perfume, and as she stood behind him at his feet weeping, she began to wet his feet with her tears, and then she wiped them with her hair and kissed them and poured perfume on them." Right? The Pharisees, they think this is ridiculous. They say, if this man were truly a prophet, he would know that who is touching him is some kind of a sinner, right? He wouldn't tolerate this. And it's so interesting because these Pharisees, who are supposed to be the religious leaders of the people, they're sinful like all of us. And they feel this need to create hierarchies. But Jesus saw the worth in every human being. This is the amazing thing. And this is what Jesus taught and what he lived. He healed sick people. He healed handicapped people. He did not turn away from lepers. While everyone else was turning away from lepers, Jesus engaged lepers in Matthew chapter 8. In fact, at the end of this passage that we've been studying, the Sermon on the Mount, do you know the first thing that happens after he comes away from teaching all of this stuff? He comes down the mountain and he encounters a leper. Right? It's very interesting. It's almost as if this was going to prove the words that he was saying. He was now going to live those in front of the people. The crowds, when they followed him and were hungry, Jesus saw to their needs. He saw them as being worthy of taking care of and of helping. He welcomed little children. He treated people the same regardless of what race they were from, what social class that they were a part of. Remember how he treated Samaritans, right? Jewish people treated Samaritans like half-breeds and really hated them. Jesus treated them with respect and dignity. He gave his first attention to the poor and to the outcast. This is the example Jesus gave. You know, when my brothers and I were young, my dad became a Christian, and he decided that he wanted to go to Bible school. And this was kind of a big thing. I was about 4 or 5 at the time. And my dad was on a really good career path. He was doing really well in insurance. He was buying and fixing up cars just for fun, and he had the money to do the things that he wanted to do. It was going pretty well. We had a new house. But he sold everything to go to Bible school because he really felt that this is what God was calling him to do. I've mentioned this before in other messages at our church, but when that happened, our kind of social class took a bit of a hit. We went to this Bible school. Dad sold everything. We moved into a little trailer in this trailer park. We knew that it would only be for a time, but it was definitely going to be a step down. I remember at that time, we just did not have money for things. We knew better even to ask for things. And at one point, when all the other kids in the trailer park were riding their bikes around, my dad felt bad, and he wanted to get me a bike. So he said, go get your piggy bank. So I'm like, okay, I got my piggy bank. And we went to an auto salvage where he found this old beat-up bike. He didn't actually make me spend my money, but he spent $5 and got me a bike. Now, I don't know if you've ever seen a bike for $5, but it wasn't much of a bike. But it was my bike, and I loved it, so it wasn't a big deal. We prized anything that we found. I remember once, I really liked playing hockey, and I wanted to, start playing goalie more. But a goalie stick, that's super expensive, right? You can't afford that. So I remember one of the hockey players on the team, the school had a team, he broke his stick, and I found it down in the arena one day. And it was broken off right where the wide part meets the shaft. So it was just the stick without the shaft on it. So I remember getting another stick that was broken and nailing them together. I thought I had the greatest prize in the world. It was just amazing. I mean, it's like a real goalie stick, right? I remember creating pads out of cushions and stuff and thinking I was like a real goalie. It was awesome. But we loved it there in the trailer park. I don't think we really even realized that we were poor. After Dad graduated, we moved back to Nova Scotia. One other thing I should mention, I think I've mentioned before, it was pretty rough. We even gleaned potatoes behind the harvesters for food. So we would go out after the harvesters went over the fields and there were some potatoes left. We would go out with bags and we would pick potatoes off the fields. We would love it when a McCain truck got turned over because it's really close to the McCain plant in Florenceville, New Brunswick. And if a truck got flipped over, they would call the school and all the students from the school would go and get free stuff like frozen French fries and stuff, right? It was kind of a thing that we did. But we did love it there. And after Dad graduated, we moved back to Nova Scotia. Again, he didn't have any money at that point, so he was just trying to find whatever he could. And so he went on a trip without Mom to buy a house. It's dumb, don't do that, okay? So he goes and he buys this house, and it was a house that hadn't been lived in 5 years. So you can imagine the condition of the house. It was an old Dutch colonial-style house right on the ocean in a little village called West Berlin, Nova Scotia, close to Liverpool. The story is that when my mom saw it for the first time, she cried. And we gutted that entire house and basically rebuilt it. Later on, when Dad took a pastoring job, he moved into the parsonage that was provided with the church. But again, finances were very tight. And celebrations like Christmas were very meager because you didn't have much. And so at Christmas, we'd get, 2 or 3 little things. But it wasn't about that, right? We still had a great time, and we loved our childhood. But I remember that first year coming back and living there in that parsonage. I was going to see a friend that I knew before my dad went to Bible school. His name was Peter. And we had kind of been best buddies when we were real little. And I was coming back and just kind of getting reacquainted with him now a few years later. And I remember at Christmas, he invited me to go over to his house and see what he got for Christmas. And I thought, okay, this will be great. So I went over, and it changed my life because I was shocked. I was shocked. I went into the house, and it was kind of like after Christmas morning. Everything had been opened, and they still hadn't cleaned up. And it was just like, it was stuff everywhere. Like the whole floor was covered in stuff like this deep, I'd swear. All kinds of toys, all kinds of gifts, just so much stuff. And it blew my mind. I had never seen anything like this. I didn't know people went to those lengths, to that kind of extreme on just material things. I couldn't understand it. Anyway, a couple of days later, I got word from my mom that Peter was going to come over to our house and that Peter was wanting to see what we got for Christmas. And I thought, oh, this will be interesting. So he came over, and I showed him the 2 or 3 little things that I had got for Christmas. And he said something. He said, oh, is that it? And I just remember at that time, it was kind of this life-defining moment where it was kind of like someone just sticking a knife in you. And I just remember in that moment thinking, how insensitive is that? Where are your priorities at? All of these thoughts were going through my head. And I loathed the attitude, and I kind of at the same time pitied him because of his perspective, how he was measuring worthiness by material things. I'm sure a little of my own pride was wrapped up in that, but I really did pity him. And I vowed in my head at that moment that I would never make someone feel bad because of what they had or didn't have. It was very powerful at that time. And there was something about that experience that ever since that moment when I would read the Bible and I would study Jesus, I would see this person who gave dignity to everybody, regardless of their status. And it just really awakened me at the right time in my life. I began to notice the way he treated people. Not just the poor, everyone was equal to Jesus. In Mark chapter 10, even a rich young man came to Jesus, the one that Jesus said, go and sell everything. And Jesus, even when he was saying those words to him, did it in the most gracious way. In fact, Mark, who records the story, says that before he said those words, Jesus looked at him and loved him. Now, Mark can't read Jesus' thoughts or his heart. Obviously, the way that Jesus was handling that situation that Mark saw, Mark was able to describe it because he saw the love coming out of Jesus, even as Jesus was saying those difficult words to that rich young man. Jesus was also gracious with the religious leaders when they came to him in sincerity, like Nicodemus. And even Matthew, who was known as Levi, the tax collector, he was an affluent outcast, but Jesus gave dignity to him too. And so in Jesus' mind, everyone deserves dignity. In 1 Peter chapter 2, Peter picked up on this. In verse 17, he says, honor everyone. Everyone. Now, for many years, in the original church that I started with Pastor Nathan and his brother Phil, Grace Community Church, there was a teenager, and some that were here a long time ago may remember. Looking back, this young guy was probably on the spectrum. And for many, many years after the service, he would come and talk to me. Not just once in a while, every week. Every week after the service. He would dominate my time, and in fairness, I really just don't think he had the social awareness to understand that he was taking all of my time and that nobody else was able to talk to me that wanted to talk to me after the service. And I had a number of people at that time tell me that I needed to avoid him or at least figure out a way to keep him from talking to me. People were offering strategies of ways to handle that. And I understood the concern, but I have to say, and maybe this connects back to stories I've just told, but in my thinking, I figured that maybe he needed the interaction more than anybody else. That was just the thought that I had in my head. I also thought to myself, if everyone is really so concerned about it, why don't they engage him and talk with him before he comes and talks to me? And a few people did. A few people did try to do that. Anyway, I never did anything about it. And I often wondered after, am I a bad leader? Like, is this what good leaders do? Because people would tell me, you shouldn't be doing that. Eventually, his family ended up attending another church. And so the problem was kind of resolved. But a number of years later, I got a call from him. And he was asking if I would perform his wedding ceremony. And I was happy to. In fact, I was very curious to meet the girl that he was marrying. Actually, that was a big motivation in it. But it was pretty cool. It was pretty special. Somewhere down deep, I just have this belief that you can't go wrong standing with the cast-offs. And I think it's clear when you read the Bible, when you read Jesus, that was his philosophy. This is the way that he lived. I don't want to just know facts about Jesus. I want to know how he acted. What was in his heart? How did he think about these things? What was his philosophy? Now, I do want to clarify, I'm a pretty self-focused person. So I know so many people who are way more compassionate. And I don't want to sound like I'm tooting my horn on this. Any progress that I have made is really only because of Jesus. And that goes back to rule number 2. Do good in a way that elevates God and not yourself. So I want to put that right out there. But I really believe God has always been with the outcast. And this isn't just from the time of Jesus. When you go back and you study the Old Testament, you see that this has always been the heart of God. Through the prophet Isaiah, God told Israel, look at Isaiah chapter 16. He says, give counsel, grant justice, make your shade like night at the height of noon. I like that expression, right? When the heat's really on people, shade them like it's nighttime. Give them protection, right? Shelter the outcasts. Do not reveal the fugitive. That's pretty interesting for whole kinds of discussions, right? Let the outcasts of Moab sojourn among you. Be a shelter to them from the destroyer, right? He had a heart for outcasts, even back in those days. And he encouraged Israel to help people that were down and out. In the Beatitudes, we already saw that Jesus is on the side of the poor in spirit, the disadvantaged. And Jesus' brother James, who knew Jesus' heart very well, he was very clear. He taught us not to show favoritism. Look at what it says in James chapter 2. My brothers and sisters, believers in our glorious Lord Jesus Christ, we must not show favoritism, James says. Suppose a man comes into your meeting wearing a gold ring and fine clothes, and a poor man in filthy old clothes also comes in. If you show special attention to the man wearing fine clothes and say, here's a good seat for you, but you say to the poor man, you stand there or sit here on the floor by my feet, have you not discriminated among yourselves and become judges with evil thoughts? In Romans chapter 2, verse 11, it says that God does not show favoritism, and this is because God gives dignity to everyone. And so this wasn't new with Jesus. Jesus is God. He's divine. He was just continuing to live as God always has. Now, I want to be clear. Dignity is not respect. It's not the same thing as respect. Some people are very respectable because they behave in a way that merits respect. You may have people in your life, maybe even parents or other authority figures, that really were not respectable and were very difficult to respect. Maybe you had a parent that was like, an alcoholic or something and really did not parent well because of that and maybe didn't deserve much respect. We're not talking about the same thing here. Dignity is an acknowledgement of someone being made in God's image. It's at a different level. And so understand that these commands are based on the fact that God gives every human being intrinsic worth. In fact, here's a fact. Being made in God's image and being valued by him is what gives every human being their intrinsic dignity or worth. This is such a foundational fact to understand. You really have to get a hold of this. It's one of the most foundational truths that exists. Your value does not come from your wealth. It doesn't come from your pedigree, from your abilities. It does not come from what you're able to produce. It does not come from your popularity. It does not come from your possessions. It only comes from God. You matter because the all-mattering one says you matter. And once you get a hold of that truth and you really grasp it and run with it, it will totally change your existence. It really will. You can move past your own personal insecurities. You can start giving love to other people because you know that you matter to the one whose opinion matters. Jesus taught us to love our neighbor as ourselves. That's rooted in the fact that they are equal in value to you because they have intrinsic worth, just like you do. And this was a revolutionary teaching at Jesus' time. We really take it for granted here in the West because we can't really step outside of where we've grown up and get perspective on how powerfully this has changed civilization in the West. But it really is a huge, huge thing. In Jesus' time, family pedigree and social standing were basically locked in, and they determined your value. Most of us have no concept of how that would work. And this teaching of the intrinsic value of human beings, it informs our beliefs on so many issues today. I mean, think about this. The topics are pretty common ones. Abortion, right? This informs that topic because it says, well, God knows and loves every person, even from the time of conception. And so human beings are precious, and this informs the way that we believe about abortion. Euthanasia, same thing. We believe that life is a precious gift and that only God can give it and take it. And so that informs that topic. The elderly and disabled, that our ability or productivity does not define our worth is really important to get a hold of. See, so just because someone's older and maybe not as productive or disabled in some way, that doesn't change their value. The whole issue of race, right? The fact that no one people group is better or worse than another group, that no one group should ever have power over another one or mistreat another one because we're all equally loved by God. Poverty, same thing. The poor are still loved by God and they should be treated with dignity. And even like faith and politics, the fact that those that we disagree with are still loved by God and they should be treated with love and dignity. And so you can see that so many topics relate directly to this. It's really foundational. Our individual worth to God is foundational to everything. As his followers, we really need to spread this message that you matter to God. And there's many ways by which we communicate that, right? As his followers, we need to give people dignity. We dignify people when we draw attention to our shared humanity. When we stop focusing on all the ways that we're different and we focus on the way that we're the same, that we're made in God's image and that God loves us, then we raise people's dignity. We dignify them. We dignify people when we treat them the way that we want to be treated because it says to them, you matter just like I matter. We dignify people when we show them love. And here's a really powerful thought. When we treat people with dignity, it's amazing how much more dignified they begin to behave. Have you ever noticed this? That people generally, sociologists have studied this, human beings generally rise to the level of the bar that is set for them and the expectation that's given to them, right? If they're called nothing and worthless and everything from the time they're young, that's pretty much, the identity that they take on. But if you tell them, hey, you're valuable, you have purpose, God loves you infinitely, he made you for a reason, right? When you raise that bar, people, they live up to that. This is the way the world works. This is the power of grace, giving people more than they deserve. The Bible teaches that it's more powerful than the law. The law was eye for eye, tooth for tooth, right? It's more powerful than karma, right? The idea that, well, you always get exactly what you deserve. No, not with God. There's this thing called grace. And he encourages his followers to exercise grace, to give people more than they deserve, to break karma. In the year 2000, the band U2 released the song Grace. This was on their All That You Can't Leave Behind album. Listen to some of the words. It's really good. It says, she takes the blame, she covers the shame, removes the stain. It could be her name, Grace. It's the name for a girl. It's also a thought that changed the world. And toward the end of the song, it says, what left a mark no longer stings because grace makes beauty out of ugly things. Grace finds beauty in everything. Grace finds goodness in everything. And so, guys, if you want to start changing the world, start following rule number 5. Treat every person with the utmost dignity. All right? Rule number 6. Examine yourself before you criticize the world. Today's 2 rules are actually joined together by a common theme. When you sit down and you look at both of them, you can see pretty quickly the common theme is that of humility. That's what we're talking about through both of these. We don't treat others with dignity when we think too highly of ourselves, right? That's what's happening there. And a lack of humility also causes us to see the problems in everyone else and not the problems in ourselves, which is what we're talking about here now in rule number 6. And so humility is really the heart of both of these rules today. Jesus taught that this thing of criticizing others and not seeing our own issues, this is a huge, huge problem in fallen, sinful human beings. In Matthew chapter 7, Jesus taught, "Do not judge, or you too will be judged. For in the same way you judge others, you will be judged. And with the measure that you use, it will be used to you, to measure you. Why do you look at the speck of sawdust in your brother's eye and pay no attention to the plank in your own eye? How can you say to your brother, 'Let me take the speck out of your eye,' when all the time there's a plank in your own eye? You hypocrite, first take the plank out of your own eye, and then you will see clearly to remove the speck from your brother's eye." It's a famous passage. Now, the word here for judge is the word krino in Greek. It's a word that gets a lot of attention as people try to understand what does this mean. It's the basic idea of deciding what is right or wrong, like we would use the word judge. But in the way that Jesus is using it here, it also carries the idea of condemnation with it. This is the spirit behind the word as Jesus is using it. In many other places, believers are told to be discerning. Sometimes the word is diakrino in Greek. And of course, we need to be discerning, right? We need to make judgments on certain things in our minds. It's an important thing for Christians to discern what is good or bad in every circumstance, right? The Bible teaches us this. It's having an attitude of condemnation that Jesus is warning us against. It's an attitude that is fed by our sinful nature that causes us to always want to look better than the next guy. And this is what Jesus was warning us against. And that's what you see here in Jesus' illustration. We want to look more morally superior, and so we point out flaws in other people. We look at the speck that's in their eye, right? Instead of looking at the blank in our own, or the plank that's in our own eye. This is what Jesus is teaching. Now, it's not that we should never come along someone and advise them and say, hey, there's something here in your life that you need to fix, that you need to correct. Of course we do that. We do it as parents. We do it with our friends and family members. We do it with people that we love and have a relationship with. It's important. We should do that. Jesus even says here that if we do things right, we will. Do you see that? We will, quote, see clearly to remove the speck from our brother's eye, right? So the point isn't that we never do that. That's not what Jesus is saying. He tells us, though, to start by removing the plank that is in our own eye first. And if we don't, we're going to fall into hypocrisy. So Jesus is teaching his followers to be people of self-reflection, and he's also teaching them to be people of self-examination. He's teaching us to be people who constantly check our own hearts and check our own egos as we go about doing the things that we do. He's teaching us to be people who look in the mirror, people who are as eager to change ourselves as we are to change the world out there. And this arrogance and attitude of superiority is the opposite of the spirit that Jesus was describing in the Beatitudes. Remember in the Beatitudes, he said, blessed are the poor in spirit. He said, blessed are the meek, right? The people that he was describing there, that was a very different spirit. It was a brokenness that Jesus is looking for. He's demonstrated over and over that he is quick to come alongside of people who demonstrate that brokenness, but people that don't have that brokenness, he actually moves away from. And this is a biblical principle. Little side note on judging. The phrase "don't judge" has been very, very misused. In Canada today, a lot of people, including Christians, will use it very glibly without proper understanding. And I want to just give you a little warning about that. I want you to understand, Jesus was not saying that we never call out sin by his teaching in this passage. People today love to say that, don't they? Don't judge. Don't judge, right? I never judge people. Right? Anyone heard people say that? Right? All the time. I never judge. And there's almost some moral superiority in the way they say it too, right? I never judge, right? I never judge people. I'm just like Jesus, right? I never judge. In other words, whatever that person wants to do, I'm okay with it. Whatever you want to do, I'm good. I'm good with it. Even things the Bible describes as sinful activity, very clearly. I don't judge. I don't judge. I hear Christians talk this way. No, that is not what Jesus was saying. It's not this just live and let live kind of mentality. I won't judge you for your sins, and you give me a pass on mine too, okay? Everything will be great. No, that's not what Jesus was teaching. I hear this phrase, don't judge, used this way all the time. The Bible teaches that we are our brother's keeper, and that some things are wrong, and that accountability is good and it's necessary. In Galatians chapter 6, Paul told us this. He says, brothers and sisters, if someone is caught in a sin, you who live by the Spirit should restore that person gently. But watch yourselves, or you also may be tempted. And so Paul gave great advice. Not only does he say that we have a responsibility to correct sinful behavior, but he says how we should do it. First of all, he says we need to be living, right, by the Spirit. In other translations, it says, you who are spiritual, restore this person. So don't go about doing it unless the Holy Spirit is living through you and is active in you. We need to be in step with the Spirit ourselves before we try to help someone else. Doesn't it sound a little bit like what Jesus was saying, right? Before you try to help someone else, right? Plank in your own eye. We need to attend to that plank first. And then when we're in the right spirit to help others, we need to do it. See what Paul says here? We need to do it gently, not with the goal of embarrassing or of one-upping or of condemning, but with a view to restoring is the word that he uses there. And Paul issues a warning immediately after this. He says, but watch yourselves. It's almost like anyone that steps in to try to correct somebody else, and any of us that ever do it, keep that little warning in your head. The moment that you go to correct somebody else, you be careful. Be careful. Watch yourselves, or you also may be tempted. Guys, I can tell you, I've seen this so much over the years. Whenever people go to correct someone else, if they are not a very mature person and a very spirit-filled person, it can very quickly turn into arrogance, a chance to look morally superior. I've seen it over and over. The temptation is subtle, and it is very powerful. And so a little warning here, guys. Our hearts are sinful and deceitful, and none of us is above being deceived by our own pride. Jeremiah 17:9 teaches us that, right? The heart is deceitful above all things and beyond cure. Who can understand it? Who can know it? You think you know your own heart. You don't know your own heart. Your heart is evil. It's contaminated by sin. It will lead you astray constantly. I've taught many times that Jesus' teaching has made me cautious about my own heart. I'm very recognizant of this. I've seen how it tries to influence my decisions to result in my own benefit, in my own pride, in my own glory. I know that my heart has this tendency. And I can tell you, being a pastor can be a great distraction from your own sinfulness. I've got 30 years of experience with this. You run around helping people with this thing and with that thing, right? You get to speak every Sunday and talk about sin and sinfulness and to how to avoid those things. It can be a great smokescreen. Guys, morality has changed in North America over the past generation. When it comes to morality, the Bible teaches us to start with ourselves. I hope you're seeing this, right? It starts here in Jesus' teaching. But with the decline of Christian influence, that reflex has kind of been lost on this generation. We no longer see the starting point of morality as our own commitment to personal integrity, as our own commitment to personal purity. This is not the way morality is defined anymore in our world. Morality has become mostly external. It's what you're doing for the planet. It's what you're doing for the environment. It's what you're doing for these social causes out there. And boy, it's really convenient because it really takes the focus off of here. This is one of the reasons why people love it so much. It's religious for a lot of people. Don't mistake it. It's really religious. But we have to be careful. You know, it's very easy to fall into the trap of becoming a hypocritical critic. Right? Someone who has all of the answers for the world's problems, but you can't even control your own impulses. And we see more and more of this all of the time. The internet, it gives everyone a voice, but it doesn't create accountability for the people who like to be vocal. You've noticed this, right? There's no accountability, right? You just launch your truth bombs out there and hide behind, The internet. It's really not that different from the Pharisees. It's kind of like modern Pharisees today. Today, people hide behind the internet. Back in those days, they hid behind religious clothing and religious rituals. But it's the same heart. It's the same spirit that people have. The internet gives everybody a voice, but it doesn't create accountability for people who like to be vocal, right? We don't get to analyze their life and see if they're actually credible, if their life matches up with the things that they're saying that they support. Jesus had no tolerance for this kind of religious superiority. I often ask myself questions like this. I don't know if you do. I think things like, how many people fight for sexual freedom because they just really like to be sexually promiscuous? I wonder how many people fight for a woman's right to choose because they actually got an abortion at some point or had a boyfriend who pushed them to get one. How many people make large gifts to charity, hopefully public, right? Because they've actually gotten rich dishonestly. I actually had a conversation with someone just a few months back in one of our prominent hospitals with pretty good information that a lot of the money that supplied the wing for that hospital did not come from a good source, right? This stuff happens all the time. How many people are environmental zealots because they really want to distract from the fact that they are polluting their own bodies on a daily basis? You ever wonder? You ever ask these questions? I'm telling you, this goes on all the time. Let's keep the focus out there, not here. Guys, I'm telling you what Jesus is saying. He says, examine yourself before you criticize the world. Jesus taught that the biggest problem is not everything that's going on out there, it's what's going on in here. And Jesus actually gave his followers some really practical advice to help us keep our sinful hearts in check. And I'm going to share a couple things before we wrap it up. In Matthew chapter 6, verses 1-4, again, back in the Sermon on the Mount, he says, be careful not to practice your righteousness in front of others to be seen by them. This is a very practical thing that you can do to guard your heart. If you do, you will have no reward from your Father in heaven. So when you give to the needy, do not announce it with trumpets, as the hypocrites do in the synagogues and on the streets, to be honored by others. Truly, I tell you, they have received their reward in full. But when you give to the needy, do not let your left hand know what your right hand is doing, so that your giving may be in secret. Then your Father who sees what is done in secret will reward you. Now, back in those days in the synagogues, when people would go and they would give at the temple, including the Pharisees, right? They literally blew trumpets to announce the giving that they were doing. Like this, he's not just making up language. This actually was happening. This is how prideful they had become in their faith practice. Now notice, Jesus doesn't say to never allow your righteous acts to be seen. We already covered this, right? Earlier on, we already saw that we're supposed to be like a city on a hill and that people are supposed to see our good deeds, right? That's actually a good thing. He's talking here about our motive. He's saying, do not practice your righteousness in front of others in order to be seen by them. This is what he is saying here. It's your motive. And if you really struggle with that, if you can't do things with a selfless motive, then keep it totally private. This is what Jesus teaches. If you keep going there in Matthew chapter 6 at verse 5, he says, and when you pray, do not be like the hypocrites, for they love to pray standing in the synagogues and on the street corners to be seen by others. Truly, I tell you, they have received their reward in full. But when you pray, go into your room, close the door, and pray to your Father who is unseen. Then your Father who sees what is done in secret will reward you. You see, that for the Pharisees, it was all about being seen, right? Always. It was always about pride. They even needed for people to see them praying, right? No religious act could be wasted. A wasted religious act was one that nobody got to see you doing. Everything had to contribute to their image. And so I want to wrap it up by asking you this question today. This one right here. This question. There we go. All right. No, back it up. There we go. Jason's just messing with me now. All right. Are you sometimes guilty of caring more about your image than about your heart? I want to leave you with that question. It's just a great question that we all need to use to check ourselves. When are you really more concerned about your image than you are about your own heart? Because the heart's deceitful. It's beyond cure. Who can understand it? We're all out of time for today. These two rules, guys, they're so foundational to Jesus' teaching. And his teaching on the value of the individual has literally shaped Western society. And it's created more peace and prosperity than the world has ever seen in the history of the world. and his charge to examine ourselves before we try to help others, it is so key to keeping our own hearts in check. It is also something that actually allows for personal growth. We can stop deceiving ourselves and filling ourselves with pride and actually see ourselves for who we are and improve in things and move forward. You know, Socrates said, the unexamined life is not worth living.
Join us on Sundays at 4 p.m. for our weekly service at 7755 10th Line North, Mississauga, or visit renewedchurch.ca/connect for more information about how you can get connected at Renewed Church.